Hello, this is International Master Nigel Povah. Last night Guildford Chess Club ran its 5th junior section, and I had the pleasure of addressing the group and decided to talk to them about opening principles. Now, before I started, I told the kids that there were 3 key principles in the opening, but I asked them, what are they? Some of them knew what those principles were and others didn't. So this little video explains some of the important key points. So we start with the first move for white, which is e4, which is always a good move, occupying the center and opening lines for piece development. Black reciprocated with e5. And this is the first key principle that I introduced to the group, which I think a number of them were aware of. And that is that one needs to try and control these 4 central squares, e4, d4, d5 and e5. And I asked the kids, they knew that this was a good idea generally, but I said, well, why? Why do you think it's important to control those key squares? And they didn't really come up with a clear answer to this. They thought it might give them a chance of attacking the enemy king, which of course is always true and good. But as I explained to them, one of the benefits of controlling the centre is that your pieces are well placed, and this gives you the opportunity to move in any particular direction that you might wish to, and this therefore ensures that your forces have greater flexibility. The next move we see from white is knight to f3. This develops a piece and it attacks the key central squares on both d4 and e5, and black, not unsurprisingly, copies by bringing his knight out to c6, and this sort of counters white's last move because this knight also targets the squares d4 and e5. So both players are following a maxim that we often hear referred to in chess, which is knights before bishops. And again, I asked them, why do you think this is a good principle? And most of them recognise that this is because knights can jump straight into the game, whereas bishops need to wait for pawns to move. However, the kids didn't point out that another reason for this is that it isn't always clear what is the best square for the bishop, as it will often have to wait for various positions to arise on the board to be clear which are its best squares to occupy. So both players here have played sensibly, bringing their knights out. Now white continues with his development and brings out a bishop and puts it on a very sensible square, and this targets a weak pawn on f7, the weakest pawn in the black camp. And this particular opening is called the Gioco Piano, or sometimes referred to as the Italian game, and it is a very reasonable and sensible way for white to develop. But white has an alternative. He can instead put his bishop on b5 instead of c4. This is also a good move. He might be threatening to capture on c6 and then capture on e5 with his knight. And this particular opening move, bishop b5 on move 3, is called the Ruy Lopez, or sometimes again called the Spanish. But if we go back to our position with the bishop on c4, black now plays bishop to c5. He's also developing his bishop to a sensible square, and both players are following the second key principle, develop your pieces. So the first key principle was try and control the center. The second one, develop your pieces, which especially means the minor pieces. Now the minor pieces are the bishops and knights, as they can come out quickly. The major pieces, which is the rooks and the queen, they'll come out a little later. As an alternative to this move, bishop c5, black can also play knight to f6, and developing the knight like this is also a perfectly reasonable move. This is called the two knights defense, and it was a line that Andrew covered in one of the earlier videos, so I won't say any more about that for now. But if you go back to bishop c5, perfectly sensible move, as I mentioned just now, and now white can castle. And this is the third key opening principle. Get your king into safety and get castled. And as you can see in this position, after only 4 moves, white has moved 1 pawn, developed 2 pieces and castled. And that's a very good sort of economy of effort. He's not had to play lots of moves to achieve several good things. So white has made a good start to the game. Black now continues with knight to f6. This is another sensible developing move, and white does the same, develops his knight to c3. And the interesting thing about this is that all 4 knights at the moment, if you look at them, all 4 knights are on their most effective squares. This is because each of them controls a circle of 8 squares, and the circle for the knight on c3 is highlighted here, showing the 8 different squares that knight actually covers. And that shows the power of the knight. It's got great scope there. Okay, some of those squares are currently occupied, but you could argue that the knight is protecting this white pawn on a2 and protecting the queen on d1 and the pawn on e4, but it also has a number of vacant squares that it could move to. So the knight has great flexibility on this square, and that's a very sensible square for it. If though, say the knight had gone to a3 instead, here you'll notice that the knight now only covers 4 squares. So in effect the knight has half as much power on this square as it has on c3. So that is why we tend to develop the knights in the direction of moving towards the centre, because that gives them more power, more scope. Anyway, after knight to c3, which was the move that we covered in the game, black now did the same as white. He castled. And what we have here is a complete mirror image of the position, or symmetrical position as it's sometimes referred to, where both players have played exactly the same moves. They've just played them in somewhat different move orders, but their positions are identical. And both players have made a good job of developing their pieces. Anyway, we continue now with white playing pawn to d3, and this is his second pawn move, and its purpose is to enable this bishop on c1 to come into the game and to be developed. Black does the same. He brings his pawn to d6, and now white plays his bishop out to g5, and this is the development of white's last minor piece to an aggressive square, creating what is called a pin. And I asked the juniors if they knew what this was called, and some of them did. Now, pins can be very annoying because they tie down a piece, in this case the knight, which has got the red circle around it. And by tying that piece down, and the reason they've tied it down is because behind the piece there is a more powerful, more valuable piece, in this case the queen, so the knight actually can't move. And when a piece is pinned like this and can't move, it is vulnerable from further attacks as it can't run away. So that means that, you know, a player, when he gets pinned, needs to be very careful about what he does and how he meets that pin. So in this particular example, black chooses to attack the bishop with his pawn and say to the bishop, right, what do you want to do? Do you want to take my knight, or do you want to retreat? Well, the best move here is to retreat back to h4. This keeps the pin in force, so the problem still exists for black, that he has to do something about this pinned knight, or he might have to in a moment, and he can meet the pin in several ways. One option would be to play the pawn to g5, breaking the pin, but that does weaken the black king position, so it's not the move I'm going to cover for now, although it is a perfectly reasonable move. Now instead, the move I'm going to show is bishop to e6, and with this black develops his last piece, and we now have a roughly equal position in which both sides have developed all of their minor pieces. And we can say now that the opening stage of the game is more or less finished, and the middle game is about to begin. Note that both sides have made only 2 or 3 pawn moves and have rightly concentrated on moving out their pieces, and have moved each of them only once, apart from this bishop on h4, which had to move for a second time because it was attacked by a pawn. So you could argue that both players have played extremely sensibly. Anyway, what I'd like to do now is just to do a little recap on the key points that junior players should remember about these important principles. So firstly, you should be trying to control the centre. That's these 4 squares in the centre: E4, D4, D5 and E5. Secondly, develop the pieces, especially the minor pieces. That's the knights and bishops. Thirdly, get castled. Put your king in a safe position. Both players have done that in this position. Fourthly, generally it is always sensible to bring out your knights before the bishops, because it's obvious where the knights should go, nearly always, but it's not always so obvious where the bishop should go. And you have to wait and see what your opponent does in order to decide which is the best squares for your bishop. And the next thing is, don't move the same piece twice unless you have to, or unless you can make a really advantageous move, like you can make a capture for something which is worth more than what you're capturing with. And the final principle is, don't make too many pawn moves in the first 10 moves. 2 to 3 or perhaps 4 at the most is a good guide. I mean, in this position on the board, we've only seen 8 moves played, but each side have only made 2 or 3 pawn moves. They've each moved all 4 of their minor pieces, and they've both each castled. If you follow all of these principles, you should be able to make a good start to all of your games, and you should get an opening position. And I think a good opening position is what we all want, because that then means we can start the middle game with confidence. And that's what I hope all of the juniors going to the Guildford Junior section will now start to do. And I hope you find this video helpful. Okay, thank you.